A small act of kindness. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Glenridge, where picket fences lined the streets and well-manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, lived a boy named Liam. At 12 years old, Liam was like many boys his age, curious, kind-hearted, and full of energy. He lived a simple, comfortable life with his parents, Sarah and Tom. Their home, a cozy 2-story house with a spacious backyard, was the heart of Liam's world, a place filled with laughter, love, and a steady routine that made Liam feel safe. Every morning, Liam woke up to the smell of his mother's pancakes and the comforting sounds of his father's voice as he read the morning news. Their life together was quiet, predictable, and perfect in many ways. But like all families, there were invisible layers beneath the surface. Subtle fears and biases that had shaped Liam's understanding of the world. His parents, Sarah and Tom, were well-meaning, hard-working people who loved their son deeply. But they had always been cautious, especially when it came to interactions with strangers. In their small town, where everyone knew everyone, any unfamiliar face was regarded with suspicion. Liam, remember, his mother would often remind him, "Not everyone out there has good intentions. Be careful around strangers, especially those who don't look like they belong here." Liam, with his innocent heart, didn't quite understand why his parents were so wary of people they didn't know. He loved meeting new faces, asking endless questions, and offering help whenever he could. But over the years, his parents' warnings had slowly seeped into his mind, and he began to adopt their cautious approach, especially when it came to people who seemed different. Still, Liam's kindness was something he couldn't suppress. He was the type of boy who would stop to help a classmate pick up their books or share his lunch with someone who forgot theirs. This internal tug-of-war between caution and compassion was a constant battle for Liam, though he was too young to fully recognize it. One warm September morning, Liam's routine life was about to take an unexpected turn. As usual, he woke up to the smell of breakfast. His mother Sarah was busy in the kitchen, packing his lunch for school, while his father Tom, as always, sat at the kitchen table, engrossed in his morning paper. "Liam, I packed an extra sandwich for you today," Sarah said as she handed him his lunch. "I figured you'd be extra hungry after soccer practice." Liam smiled. His mother always seemed to know exactly what he needed. "Thanks, Mom," he said, giving her a quick hug before heading out the door. As he reached for his backpack, his father glanced up from the newspaper. "Liam, remember to be careful on your way home. I heard there's been a homeless man hanging around near the park lately. Just keep to yourself and come straight home. Okay?" Liam nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words settle on him. "I will, Dad. Don't worry." The walk to school was peaceful, the early morning sun casting soft golden light across the streets. Liam's mind was already drifting to thoughts of soccer practice and the new video game he hoped to play that evening. The day passed as usual, class after class, laughing with friends, and a quick soccer scrimmage after school. As the final bell rang, Liam slung his backpack over his shoulder and began his walk home. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the ground as Liam made his way through the quiet streets. He enjoyed these walks, the moments where he could lose himself in his thoughts. But today, something caught his eye as he neared the small park just a few blocks from his house. There, sitting alone on a park bench, was a man Liam had never seen before. His clothes were worn and dirty, his hair unkempt, and his skin deeply tanned, as if he'd spent years under the harsh sun. The man sat hunched over, his eyes cast down, his shoulders slumped in a way that made Liam's heart ache a little. For a moment, Liam froze, his father's warning from that morning echoing in his mind. Is this the man Dad was talking about? His instinct was to walk past quickly, to avoid eye contact, and pretend he hadn't seen the man. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the man sat, so still and defeated, or the way his eyes seemed to carry a quiet sadness. Whatever it was, Liam found himself unable to simply walk away. Liam stood there, his heart racing. His parents had always taught him to be cautious around strangers, especially those who looked out of place. But something about the man made Liam pause. He wasn't scary. He wasn't yelling or acting strange. He was just there, quiet, tired, and alone. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Liam reached into his backpack and pulled out the extra sandwich his mother had packed. His heart pounded in his chest as he hesitated for a moment, wondering what his parents would say. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he walked over to the man. Excuse me, sir," Liam said, his voice barely a whisper. The man looked up slowly, his tired eyes meeting Liam's. "I have an extra sandwich. Would you like it?" The man's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then softened. A small, weary smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "That's mighty kind of you, young man," he said in a rough but gentle voice. "I'd appreciate that very much." Liam handed him the sandwich, their hands brushing briefly. The man's hand was rough and calloused, a sign of hard times and even harder work. He took the sandwich with a quiet "thank you," his voice thick with gratitude. For a brief moment, they just looked at each other. Liam, the young boy with a heart full of questions, and the man whose eyes told a story of hardship and loneliness. Then, as if the moment had never happened, Liam turned and continued his walk home. As he walked away, his mind swirled with conflicting emotions. He felt proud of what he'd done, but also nervous about what his parents might say if they found out. He glanced back once, just in time to see the man carefully unwrapping the sandwich, holding it as if it were a precious gift. A small smile crept across Liam's face, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. But as he turned a corner and his house came into view, a pang of worry hit him. What if Mom and Dad were right? What if I shouldn't have done that? When he walked through the front door, his mother was already waiting for him, her face creased with worry. "Liam, where have you been? You're late," Sarah said, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm sorry, Mom. I walked home a little slower today," Liam mumbled, guilt gnawing at his insides. She studied him for a moment, sensing something was off. "Is everything okay? Did something happen?" Liam hesitated. For a moment, he considered telling her about the man and the sandwich. But then he remembered his father's warning and decided to keep it to himself. "No, everything's fine. I'm just tired from soccer practice," he said with a forced smile. As he headed upstairs to his room, Liam had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world around him. If only he had known what was coming, maybe he would have thought twice about offering that sandwich. But for now, all he knew was that he had done something that felt right. Little did he know, the ripples of that decision were about to turn his quiet, comfortable world upside down in ways he could never have imagined. Unraveling the layers, the following day was heavy with anticipation. Jack's world had been tipped on its axis after the court appearance, and he felt a sense of unease bubbling just beneath the surface. He had only wanted to do something kind, but now, that simple gesture had turned into a tangled web of legal proceedings, emotions, and complex truths about people he didn't fully understand. At breakfast, the usual clatter of spoons against cereal bowls was drowned out by the tension that hung in the air. Susan sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her eyes distant as if she were elsewhere, while David flipped through the newspaper with tight, jerky motions. Jack sat between them, poking at his food, feeling like he was in the middle of a silent storm. "I still don't think it's a good idea," David muttered, finally breaking the silence. His eyes flickered over the edge of the paper toward Susan. Susan lowered her cup, a sigh escaping her lips. "David, I've thought about this all night. We can't make assumptions without hearing the other side. We're always telling Jack not to judge a book by its cover, right?" "This isn't some after-school lesson," David said, his voice edging with frustration. "The man is a criminal. He robbed a gas station. You saw the police reports." What if he's dangerous? You want to go see him in jail. What if he hurts you? Susan's gaze softened as she looked over at Jack. I don't believe that Elijah Johnson is just a criminal. We've only seen a small piece of his story, and I think Jack's right. There's more to him than what we know. Besides, it's not like I'll be alone. We'll meet in a secured environment. And I'm not naive. David, I'll be careful. David shook his head, his face clouded with frustration. He looked like he wanted to say something more, but held back. Jack could feel the tension between his parents and hated being the cause of it. Maybe I should go too, Jack blurted, surprising himself. His words hung in the air, making both his parents pause. David's eyes widened, clearly caught off guard by the suggestion. Absolutely not, Jack. It's bad enough your mother wants to get involved in this mess. I don't want you anywhere near that man. But Dad, Jack started, but his father's stern gaze silenced him. Susan interjected softly, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. I know you want to help, sweetie, but I think it's best if I go first. I'll talk to him and see if there's anything more we should know. If I feel safe, we'll reconsider. Jack looked down at his plate, a mix of frustration and relief settling in his chest. He wanted to know more about Elijah, to understand why someone who had seemed so kind could also be accused of a crime. But deep down, he was also afraid of what he might discover. Susan's decision to visit Elijah Johnson weighed heavily on her as she drove toward the county jail the next day. The world outside the car window felt distant, her thoughts swirling around what might happen during the visit. Why was she so driven to do this? She wasn't entirely sure. Maybe it was Jack's insistence that Elijah was different, or maybe it was the nagging feeling in her gut that they were missing something important. Whatever the reason, she couldn't shake the need to see Elijah face to face. Pulling up to the large gray building, she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. The jail loomed ahead like an impassable fortress, cold and uninviting. As she parked the car, she took a deep breath and tried to steady her nerves. Inside, the process of checking in felt strangely clinical. She handed over her ID, signed some forms, and was led through a series of security checkpoints. The sound of heavy doors clanging shut behind her only heightened her anxiety. A guard escorted her into a small visitation room, furnished with a simple table and 2 chairs. The walls were bare, painted in a drab beige, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, adding to the sterile atmosphere. After what felt like an eternity, the door on the opposite side of the room creaked open, and Elijah Johnson walked in, shackled at the wrists and ankles. His presence was subdued but composed, his eyes tired yet steady. He wore a plain jumpsuit, a far cry from the clean-cut appearance he'd had in court. But despite the circumstances, there was something undeniably human about him, something that made Susan's earlier fears seem trivial. Elijah sat down across from her, his movements slow and deliberate. He raised his gaze to meet hers, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, 2 strangers caught in a situation neither had anticipated. Susan wasn't sure how to begin, so she started with the simplest truth. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said quietly, her hands resting awkwardly on the table. Elijah nodded, his voice calm but low. "I wasn't sure what to expect. They don't tell you much when you're in here." There was a pause, and Susan felt the weight of all the questions she had wanted to ask pressing down on her. Where should she begin? What could she say to a man accused of robbery, to the man who had become a central figure in her son's life for reasons neither of them had expected? I don't know how to ask this, but my son, Jack, he can't stop thinking about you. You've become part of our family's life in a way I never imagined." Susan began, choosing her words carefully. "He believes in the kindness he saw in you that day. But the police, they say you robbed a gas station. I need to know, who are you really?" Elijah's expression softened, and for the first time, Susan saw a glimpse of something deeply personal beneath his tired exterior. His eyes, which had seemed so distant in court, now revealed layers of pain, regret, and something else, hope, perhaps. I wish I could explain it all, he said after a long pause. But I don't think anything I say would erase what happened or make it right. I made mistakes, no doubt about it. But I'm not the man people think I am. I'm not a thief, Susan. I was desperate. Desperation can make you do things you never thought you'd be capable of. The words hung in the air, a heavy truth that seemed to change the atmosphere in the room. Elijah wasn't making excuses. He was acknowledging his actions while also revealing the depth of the hardship he had endured. Susan felt her heart ache as she listened, torn between the reality of the crime and the humanity of the man before her. Why? She asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Why did it happen? Elijah leaned forward slightly, his shackles rattling as he shifted. I lost everything. My job, my home, my family. I was on the street, barely scraping by. That gas station was a mistake. I wasn't looking to hurt anyone. I wasn't even looking for money at first. I just wanted something to eat. I was hungry, and it all spiraled out of control after that. The next thing I knew, I was being chased down like a criminal. And I couldn't stop it. It was like the world had already decided who I was. His voice cracked at the end, and Susan felt a lump form in her throat. The story was familiar in its tragedy, and yet it was deeply personal in the way it intersected with their lives. Elijah's desperation had led to a series of events that neither of them could have predicted, and now they were both here, trying to make sense of it all. I don't know what Jack saw in me that day, Elijah continued, his voice steadier now. But it was a reminder that I hadn't completely lost myself, that maybe there was still a part of me worth saving. Tears welled up in Susan's eyes as she listened. She thought about her son, about his innocence, and his unwavering belief in the goodness of people, even in the face of uncertainty. It was a belief that, until now, she hadn't fully understood. But sitting here, across from Elijah, she began to see what Jack had seen. A man who had fallen on hard times, who had made mistakes, but who still had dignity, still had worth. Jack doesn't see you as a criminal, Susan said, her voice thick with emotion. He sees you as someone who needed help. And maybe he's right. Maybe we were wrong to judge you so quickly. Elijah looked at her with a mix of gratitude and surprise. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Susan replied, wiping her eyes. I just needed to hear your side of the story. For Jack, for my family. We need to understand. As their conversation continued, Susan felt her perspective shifting. This man wasn't just a figure in a police report or a defendant in a courtroom. He was a person, someone who had faced unimaginable hardship and who had been forced into decisions that most people could never comprehend. It didn't excuse the crime, but it did explain it in a way that made it impossible to dismiss him as just another criminal. When the visit ended, Susan stood up and looked at Elijah one last time. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I think Jack was right about you. You deserve a second chance, Elijah. Elijah's eyes filled with emotion, and he nodded silently, his voice too thick to respond. As Susan left the jail and walked back to her car, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, and that her family would have to grapple with everything they had learned. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. And Jack, well, he had been right all along. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness could change everything. Breaking chains. The car ride home was a blur for Susan. She replayed her conversation with Elijah Johnson over and over in her mind, the weight of his words settling deeper into her bones. There was no denying the complexity of the situation. Elijah had committed a crime, yes, but his story wasn't that of a hardened criminal. It was one of desperation, poverty, and survival. The gravity of his confession tugged at her, and she knew that whatever decision they made as a family, it wouldn't be an easy one. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lawn. Jack was already waiting by the door, a ball of nervous energy as he rushed to greet her. "Mom, how did it go?" His eyes were wide with anticipation, a mix of hope and fear swirling in his expression. Susan smiled gently, her hand resting on Jack's shoulder. "Let's talk inside. We'll wait for your father." Jack nodded, though his face betrayed the impatience he was feeling. He followed her inside, fidgeting slightly as they made their way to the living room. Susan couldn't help but notice how grown-up he seemed, even in his anxiousness. This entire ordeal had changed him, made him more aware of the world's complexities in ways she hadn't expected. A little while later, David came home. The air was still tense between them. The conversation from earlier that morning left unresolved. He looked at Susan with a mix of wariness and concern, and she knew he was bracing himself for what she was about to say. "All right," David said, setting his briefcase down and then loosening his tie. "What happened? Did you meet with him?" Susan nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, I did. And it was complicated, David. He told me about his life, about why he did what he did." David frowned, crossing his arms. "Let me guess, he had some sob story about how it wasn't really his fault." "It's not that simple," Susan replied, keeping her tone calm. "He didn't deny the robbery. He knows what he did was wrong. But he wasn't after money, not at first. He was desperate, starving, homeless. He went into that gas station looking for food, and everything spiraled out of control from there." David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Desperation doesn't excuse breaking the law, Susan. I'm not saying it does," she said, her voice firmer now. "But it helps us understand why he did it. Elijah isn't some dangerous criminal. He's a man who hit rock bottom and made a terrible decision because he felt like he had no other choice." Jack had been silent until now, but he couldn't hold back any longer. "Dad, you didn't see him like I did. He was kind to me. He didn't hurt anyone. Maybe he made a mistake, but that doesn't mean he's a bad person. Can't we help him?" David's jaw tightened, and he looked from Jack to Susan, torn between his desire to protect his family and the weight of the moral dilemma they were facing. "Help him? How exactly do you think we're supposed to do that?" David asked, his tone more weary than angry. "We can start by supporting him in court," Susan said quietly. "Maybe we can help him get a lighter sentence, or at least make sure he gets the chance to explain his side of the story. Elijah isn't asking for pity. He's asking for fairness." David let out a long breath and sat down on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, as he struggled with his emotions. "I just don't want to make a mistake here, Susan," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't want us to get involved with something dangerous. What if we're wrong about him?" "I understand," Susan replied, sitting beside him. "I had the same fears, but after meeting him, I don't think we are wrong. I think he deserves another chance, and Jack does too." David looked at his son, who was watching the conversation unfold with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Jack had always been idealistic, but David could see that this situation had affected him on a much deeper level. It wasn't just a child's naive belief in the goodness of people. Jack was wrestling with the complexities of right and wrong, justice and compassion, in a way that had matured him almost overnight. "All right," David said after a long pause, his voice softening. "I'll trust your judgment, Susan. We'll see what we can do to help him. But we need to be careful. I don't want any of us getting hurt, especially you, Jack." Jack's face lit up, and he immediately threw his arms around his father. "Thank you, Dad. I promise you won't regret it." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, court documents, and trying to navigate the labyrinth of the legal system. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Susan questioned whether they were doing the right thing. But every time she thought of Elijah sitting in that sterile visitation room, she remembered his words, the desperation, the regret, and the glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption. Their family lawyer, Mr. Patel, had been initially skeptical about taking on Elijah's case, especially considering the overwhelming evidence against him. But after hearing Susan's account of the visit and learning more about Elijah's background, he agreed to meet with him. After their meeting, Patel saw enough potential in Elijah's story to take the case, albeit with caution. It's not going to be easy, Mr. Patel had warned them during their first strategy meeting. The prosecution is pushing for a harsh sentence, especially since this isn't his first offense. He's been in trouble before. Minor stuff, mostly, but it'll still work against him. Susan and David exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't known about Elijah's prior record. What kind of trouble? David asked, his tone guarded. Petty theft, mostly, Mr. Patel explained. Nothing violent. But it paints a picture, and the prosecution is going to use that to argue that he's an habitual offender. We'll have to counter that by focusing on the circumstances that led to the gas station incident, his homelessness, his mental health, his desperation. We'll also need to present character witnesses who can speak to his humanity, his potential for rehabilitation. Can we be witnesses? Jack asked, his voice filled with determination. Mr. Patel smiled gently. You can. But we'll need more than that. People who knew him before things fell apart, maybe a former employer, friends, anyone who can testify that Elijah is more than just his mistakes. It was a daunting task, and as the court date loomed closer, Susan found herself reaching out to people from Elijah's past, hoping to find someone willing to vouch for him. Most of them had moved on, distanced themselves from his troubles, or simply hadn't kept in touch. It was frustrating, but she refused to give up. Then, one evening, after a long day of phone calls and dead ends, Susan received a message that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a woman named Marissa, someone who had worked with Elijah years ago. She had heard through the grapevine that Susan was trying to help him, and she wanted to talk. Susan immediately called her, and they arranged to meet at a local cafe the next day. Marissa was in her early 30s with kind eyes and a quiet strength about her. Over cups of coffee, she shared her memories of working alongside Elijah at a construction company years ago. He was always a hard worker, Marissa said, stirring her drink thoughtfully. Reliable, honest. He wasn't the type to get into trouble back then. But I remember when things started going south. His mom got sick, cancer, I think. And it really hit him hard. He took time off to care for her. And after she passed, well, he wasn't the same. Lost his job, lost his place. He started drifting, couldn't find steady work. I think that's when things really went downhill for him. Susan listened carefully, her heart heavy as she imagined the weight of everything Elijah had been carrying. Do you think he could turn things around if he had the chance? Marissa looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded. I think so. He wasn't a bad guy, just lost. If he had the right support, maybe things would be different. That conversation gave Susan the push she needed to keep fighting. With Marissa agreeing to testify on Elijah's behalf, they finally had a glimmer of hope going into the trial. The courtroom was packed on the day of Elijah's sentencing hearing. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the low murmur of voices blending into a steady hum as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. Elijah sat at the defense table, looking more composed than Susan had seen him in a long time, though there was a quiet apprehension in his eyes. The prosecution laid out its case first, painting Elijah as a repeat offender, someone who had continually skirted the law and needed to be made an example of. It was a harsh argument, and Susan felt a sinking sensation in her stomach as she listened to the prosecutor's words. Then it was their turn. Mr. Patel spoke eloquently about the circumstances surrounding Elijah's life. The loss of his mother, the joblessness, the spiral into homelessness. He argued for mercy, for a sentence that took into account not just the crime, but the person behind it. Marissa's testimony was powerful, painting a picture of the Elijah she had known, the hard-working man who had cared for his sick mother, who had tried to do the right thing, even when life had knocked him down. And then Jack took the stand. "I know what Elijah did was wrong," Jack said, his voice steady despite the nerves Susan knew he must be feeling. "But when I talked to him that day at the gas station, I didn't see a criminal. I saw someone who was just scared and hungry. He could have hurt me, but he didn't. He just wanted help. And I think if we give him a chance, he can turn things around." As Jack stepped down, Susan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Her son had grown so much through all of this, and she was grateful that they had come together as a family to do what they believed was right. Finally, it was Elijah's turn to speak. He stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he addressed the judge. "I don't have any excuses for what I did," Elijah said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I messed up. I know that. But I'm not a bad person. I just lost my way. If you give me a chance, I'll do better. I'll work hard. I'll stay out of trouble. I just need a second chance." The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. There was a long, tense silence as he considered everything that had been said. Finally, he spoke. "Elijah Johnson, the crime you committed was serious. But I have also heard compelling testimony about your circumstances, and I believe that you have the potential for rehabilitation. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 2 years of probation, with mandatory counseling and community service." There was a collective sigh of relief from Susan and her family. Elijah turned to them, his eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't complete freedom, but it was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild, to make amends. As they left the courtroom, Jack walked beside Elijah, his youthful optimism shining through. "You're going to make it, Elijah. I know you will." Elijah smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded. "Thanks, kid. I'm going to try." And as they stepped out into the crisp autumn air, Susan felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. They had taken a risk, opened their hearts to someone in need, and in doing so, they had found a new sense of purpose as a family. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Susan was confident they were on the right path. Rebuilding. The days following the sentencing were a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Elijah had been given a second chance, but with that came the responsibility of making sure he didn't fall back into the life that had nearly swallowed him whole. Susan felt a constant hum of anxiety as she tried to reconcile her relief with the reality of what lay ahead. There were still so many unknowns, and Elijah's future was far from certain. A few days after the trial, Susan found herself back in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea and staring out the window. The autumn leaves had fully turned, a riot of red, orange, and gold swaying in the cool breeze. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts, when the doorbell rang. Jack was the first to the door, and when he opened it, there stood Elijah. He looked different, clean-shaven, his clothes no longer the disheveled rags he had worn during their first encounters. There was a hesitance in his posture, a man unsure of his place in the world, but also a quiet determination that Susan hadn't seen before. "Hey," Elijah said, his voice soft. "I wanted to stop by and thank you, all of you. I don't know if I'd still be standing here if it weren't for what you did for me." Jack grinned widely, stepping aside to let Elijah in. "You don't have to thank us. We're just glad you're okay." Susan stood up and moved toward the doorway, her smile warm but tentative. "Elijah, it's good to see you. How are you feeling? How's everything going?" He shrugged, his eyes dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting hers again. "It's a lot. I'm trying to get used to this, you know. The idea that I don't have to keep running. But I'm scared too. Probation feels like this weight hanging over me, like one wrong move, and it's all over." Susan nodded, understanding the pressure he must be feeling. "It's going to take time. No one expects you to have it all figured out right away. The important thing is that you're here, and you've got support." They sat together in the living room, the three of them talking about everything that had happened since the trial. Elijah shared that he had started therapy, part of his probation terms, and that it was already helping him unravel the years of pain and struggle he had buried. "It's not easy," he admitted. "Digging up all that stuff. My mom, losing my job, the way I let myself fall so far. But the counselor, she's good. She's helping me see things differently, helping me figure out how to stop blaming myself for everything." "That's a good step," Susan said encouragingly. "You've been carrying so much for so long. It's okay to let some of that go." Jack, always eager to help, leaned forward. "So, what's next? Do you have any plans? Like for work or anything?" Elijah smiled at Jack's youthful enthusiasm. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that. There's a program my counselor told me about, for people coming out of tough situations. They help with job training and finding work. I'm going to look into it, see if I can get back into construction. It's what I know, and I was good at it once." "That sounds perfect," Susan said, her heart lifting at the thought of Elijah getting back on his feet. "If you need any help with applications or anything, just let us know." Elijah's expression softened, touched by the offer. "Thanks. I'll take you up on that, Susan. Honestly, it feels good just to know I'm not alone in this." The next few months were a slow but steady climb for Elijah. He threw himself into the probation requirements, attending counseling sessions, staying out of trouble, and working with the job training program he had joined. It wasn't an easy road. There were days when the weight of his past felt unbearable, and the urge to slip back into old habits gnawed at him. But each time those dark thoughts crept in, he reminded himself of the second chance he had been given. Susan stayed in close contact with Elijah during that time, offering her support in any way she could. Sometimes it was as simple as helping him navigate paperwork or offering words of encouragement when he felt overwhelmed. Other times, it was just a cup of coffee and a conversation. Human connection to remind him that he wasn't as alone as he had once felt. For Jack, the experience of helping Elijah had deepened his understanding of the world in ways he couldn't have imagined. He had seen firsthand how life could break a person, but he had also learned that with kindness, patience, and determination, people could be rebuilt. It was a lesson that stayed with him, shaping his outlook as he moved through high school and into his future. One evening, several months after the trial, Susan and David sat in the living room, quietly unwinding from their day. David had just finished reviewing some work documents when he glanced over at Susan, who was lost in thought, staring at the fireplace. "You've been thinking about Elijah again, haven't you?" he asked gently. Susan smiled, nodding. "I can't help it. I'm just so proud of how far he's come. It's not easy, you know, to pull yourself out of that kind of darkness." David leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "You're right. He's come a long way. And you were a big part of that." Susan shook her head. "It wasn't just me. It was Jack too. You saw how much he believed in Elijah, how much he wanted to help. I think that made all the difference." David's expression softened. "He gets that from you. That stubborn belief in people, that drive to make things better." Susan laughed softly. "Maybe, but I think Jack has his own way of seeing the world. He's always had that hope, that desire to do the right thing. It's something special." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the warmth of the fire casting a golden glow across the room. It was in that quiet moment that Susan realized how much their lives had changed because of Elijah, not just his life, but theirs as well. They had grown as a family, learning to trust each other in new ways, to confront their fears and doubts, and to embrace the messy, complicated reality of helping someone in need. Just then, the doorbell rang, breaking the tranquility of the evening. Susan glanced at David, who raised an eyebrow in curiosity. "I'll get it," Susan said, rising from her seat. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a sight that filled her with unexpected joy. Elijah stood there, holding a small bouquet of flowers in one hand and a modest certificate in the other. He looked healthier, more confident than she had ever seen him, and his smile was genuine, lighting up his face. "Hey, Susan," he said, his voice steady. I wanted to stop by and give you something." She stepped aside to let him in, her curiosity piqued. "What's this all about?" Elijah handed her the certificate, and as she read it, her eyes filled with tears. It was an official notice of completion. He had finished his probation, met all the requirements, and had successfully completed the job training program. "I'm starting a new job next week," Elijah said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Construction site management. It's not just labor this time. They're training me to lead projects, supervise crews. It's more than I ever thought I'd have again." Susan beamed, her heart swelling with pride for him. "Elijah, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you." He held out the flowers, his smile sheepish. "These are for you. I wanted to thank you for everything. I know I wasn't easy to help, but you never gave up on me." Susan took the flowers, her throat tight with emotion. "You didn't give up on yourself, Elijah. That's what matters." David came over, having overheard the conversation. He extended his hand to Elijah, his expression one of respect. "Congratulations, you earned this." Elijah shook his hand, nodding. "Thank you, and thank you for trusting me, even when you didn't have to." As the evening unfolded, they sat together, talking and laughing, the weight of the past finally lifting. Elijah had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in years, it was a road filled with possibility and hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, rebuilding, and finding his way back to the man he had once been. And as Susan watched him, she realized that in helping Elijah, they had all been transformed. It wasn't just about redemption for him. It was about understanding that even in the darkest moments, there is always light. There is always the possibility of a new beginning, if you're willing to fight for it. And they had, together, the new horizon. The seasons changed again, marking the passage of time since Elijah's fresh start. Winter's chill gave way to the hopeful warmth of spring, and with it, life seemed to bloom anew for everyone involved. Elijah had settled into his job as a site manager, and while the work was tough, it suited him. He found comfort in the rhythm of building things from the ground up, a mirror to his own journey. For Susan, life at home had regained a sense of normalcy, but something had shifted deep within her. Her relationship with Jack had evolved into a partnership, a bond that now included a mutual understanding of how fragile life could be. Jack had grown from the curious, idealistic teenager into a young man with a keen sense of justice, and much of that change had come from watching Elijah's transformation. One Saturday afternoon, Susan found herself at the community center for a meeting with a local charity group she volunteered with. As she walked into the familiar space, she noticed someone at the far end of the room, standing near a bulletin board. Elijah. He hadn't seen her yet. His focus was on the notices pinned to the board, flyers for local events, community service projects, and volunteer opportunities. He looked different again, but this time not just in appearance. His entire demeanor had shifted. He stood taller, more self-assured, and there was a peacefulness about him that had once been absent. "Elijah," Susan called out, waving as she approached. He turned, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. "Susan, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she said, her tone light. "I'm part of a charity group that organizes food drives and community outreach. What about you?" Elijah shrugged modestly. "I've been coming here a lot lately, actually. I wanted to start giving back, you know. I spent so long taking, surviving, and now that I'm stable, I feel like it's time to do something for others. I've been volunteering a bit, mostly with construction-related projects, helping fix up houses for people who need it. It feels good." Susan's heart warmed at his words. The man standing before her now was a far cry from the broken, desperate soul she had first met. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't just about his own survival anymore. It was about making a difference, the same way others had for him. "That's incredible," Susan said, genuinely moved. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah. You've come such a long way." He smiled, the kind of smile that only comes from someone who's made peace with their past. It's funny. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to say this, but I'm happy. I'm really happy. I've got a good job. I'm sober. I'm building relationships. It's more than I ever thought I deserved. You absolutely deserve it, Susan said firmly. You worked for this, Elijah. Don't ever doubt that. Later that evening, after Susan had returned home from the community center, she found herself reflecting on everything that had changed. Life had moved on, but in many ways, it had also deepened. The experience with Elijah had taught her so much, not just about him, but about herself. She had learned how to trust in her own instincts, to believe in people even when others didn't, and most of all, to never underestimate the power of kindness. As she sat in the kitchen, sipping her evening tea, Jack came in, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He had just come back from spending the day with friends, but Susan could see that something was on his mind. "Hey, Mom," he said, dropping his bag by the door. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course," Susan said, gesturing for him to sit down. "What's going on?" Jack hesitated for a moment, running his fingers through his hair, something he always did when he was nervous. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Elijah, about everything we did to help him, and how it changed things. And I don't know, I guess it made me realize that I want to do something like that with my life." Susan's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She wanted to hear him out. "I mean, I don't know exactly what that looks like yet," Jack continued, "but I've been looking into different programs. Community outreach, maybe social work, or something in criminal justice. I just feel like I want to help people. The way we helped Elijah. I want to make a difference." Susan's heart swelled with pride, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Jack's compassion had always been one of his strongest traits, but hearing him articulate it like this, knowing that he was thinking about his future in such a meaningful way, moved her deeply. "That's amazing, Jack," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you had a big heart, but hearing you say this, I'm so proud of you." Jack smiled, a little shyly. "Yeah, you think it's a good idea. I think it's the best idea," Susan said. "You're going to change lives, just like you did for Elijah. Whatever path you choose, you're going to make a difference." Jack looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." Over the next few months, Jack dove into researching different careers and volunteer opportunities that would allow him to channel his passion for helping others. He started spending more time at the community center, much like Elijah, working with local charities and learning about the various ways people could give back. Meanwhile, Elijah's life continued on its upward trajectory. He had become a regular fixture at the community center, not just as a volunteer, but as someone others looked up to. His story of redemption had spread, and more people in the community were turning to him for advice and support. He became a mentor to others who were trying to rebuild their lives, offering them the same hope that Susan and Jack had given him. One afternoon, as Elijah was helping to repair a dilapidated home for a family in need, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. There was a time when he had believed his life was over, that he was destined to stay lost in the darkness forever. But now, as he hammered nails into the wooden beams of the house, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had built something real, not just for himself, but for others. He had created a life of purpose, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free. The years passed, and the bonds between Susan, Jack, and Elijah only grew stronger. They became a kind of extended family, bound not by blood, but by the shared experience of overcoming hardship and finding hope on the other side. Jack eventually went off to college, choosing to study social work with a focus on rehabilitation and reintegration programs for people who had been through the criminal justice system. His work was driven by the same passion he had found during Elijah's struggle, and it brought him immense fulfillment. Elijah, too, continued to grow in his role as a mentor and community leader. He had started his own small construction company, hiring others who were trying to turn their lives around. It wasn't just about building houses anymore. It was about building futures. For every person he hired, he offered not just a job, but a second chance, just like the one he had been given. As for Susan, she watched all of this unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Her life had returned to its familiar routine, but she knew that it had been forever changed by the ripple effects of helping Elijah. She had learned that kindness, no matter how small, could create waves that touched far more lives than she could have ever imagined. And so, as the sun set on another day, Susan sat on her porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. She thought about everything that had happened, all the lives that had intertwined, and all the good that had come from a single act of compassion. She smiled to herself, knowing that in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't just Elijah who had been saved. They had all been changed, healed, and rebuilt piece by piece, and they had done it together. Legacies in the making. The years rolled by with a quiet momentum, a soft yet undeniable current that swept everyone along. Life had settled into a comforting rhythm, but it was anything but stagnant. Every season brought new challenges and opportunities, each one shaping the lives of Susan, Jack, and Elijah in profound ways. Susan had taken on more responsibility at the charity she volunteered with, eventually becoming a coordinator for a range of community initiatives. It was work that filled her with purpose, giving her the chance to help those struggling to find their footing, just as she had once done for Elijah. She found joy in watching people discover their strength, their second chances, and a future that once seemed impossible. But despite her expanding role in the community, her thoughts always drifted back to the foundation of it all: her family and the bond they shared with Elijah. They had become something more than friends, more than acquaintances bound by circumstance. They were, in every sense, a family. And Susan cherished every moment they spent together, knowing the deep connection that now existed between them. One warm evening, with summer on the horizon, the three of them found themselves gathered at Susan's house. Jack had come home from college for the weekend, looking taller and more confident than ever. Elijah arrived shortly after, bringing with him a six-pack of soda and a smile that spoke of how far he had come. The three sat on Susan's back porch, the scent of blooming flowers wafting through the air as they sipped their drinks and talked about life. Jack was sharing stories from his social work courses, passionately describing the projects he was working on and the people he was meeting. "I'm working on this initiative to help recently released inmates transition back into society," Jack explained, his eyes lighting up as he spoke. "It's really tough for a lot of them. Finding jobs, getting housing, reconnecting with their families. A lot of people don't realize how much they struggle, even after they've served their time. But if we can give them the right support, the right opportunities, well, it makes a world of difference." Elijah nodded, listening intently. "You're right. I've seen it firsthand. A lot of the guys I work with now, my crew, they were in the same boat. They got out and couldn't find a job because of their record. Nobody wanted to give them a chance. That's why I hire them. I was there once, and I know how hard it is to start over." Jack smiled, clearly encouraged by Elijah's words. "That's exactly it. It's all about second chances, and the work you're doing, Elijah, it's incredible. You're giving people hope. I'm trying to do the same thing, just from a different angle." Susan sat back, taking it all in. She marveled at how both Jack and Elijah had found their calling in life. They had both turned their struggles into something meaningful, something that not only benefited them but uplifted others. It was as if they were two branches of the same tree, each growing in their own direction, but rooted in the same soil of compassion and resilience. As the evening wore on, the conversation took on a more reflective tone. "You know," Elijah said, his voice quieter now, "there are days when I still can't believe how far I've come. I look back at the man I was when we first met, Susan, and it feels like a different lifetime. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't given me that chance. I wouldn't be here, that's for sure." Susan reached out and touched his arm gently. You've done the hard work, Elijah. I just helped you see what was already there." Elijah smiled, but his eyes were misty. "It was more than that, though. You didn't just help me. What you and Jack did changed my whole life. And now, I'm in a position where I can do that for other people. It's like a ripple effect, you know. One act of kindness, one person believing in you, it spreads. It keeps going." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about legacies. Not just the kind you leave behind after you're gone, but the kind you build while you're still here. The ways you affect people, how they remember you, and how those memories shape their lives. I want to build something like that." "You already are," Susan said, her voice filled with pride. "Both of you are." That summer turned out to be a pivotal one for Jack. He had been offered an internship with a nonprofit organization that specialized in prisoner rehabilitation and reintegration, and the opportunity excited him beyond words. The program would take him to a different city for a few months, but it was exactly the kind of hands-on experience he craved. The night before he was set to leave, Jack sat down with Susan in the living room. The house was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic outside. "Mom," Jack said, breaking the silence, "I want to thank you." Susan looked up from the book she had been reading, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "For what?" "For everything," Jack said. "For being there, for supporting me, for teaching me how important it is to help others. I wouldn't be the person I am today if it wasn't for you." Susan's eyes softened. "Jack, I didn't do anything special. I just tried to do what was right." "You did more than that," Jack insisted. "You gave me a foundation. You showed me what it means to be compassionate, to fight for others, and to never give up on people. Watching you and Elijah, it changed my whole perspective on life. I want to make you proud." Susan's heart swelled with emotion, and for a moment she couldn't find the words to respond. Finally, she reached over and took his hand. "You already have, Jack, every single day." The months flew by, and Jack's internship proved to be everything he had hoped for. He worked closely with formerly incarcerated individuals, helping them navigate the complicated process of re-entering society. It was challenging work, often frustrating, but also deeply rewarding. For the first time, Jack felt like he was making a tangible difference in people's lives, just as he had dreamed of doing. Elijah, too, continued to thrive. His construction business had grown, and he had hired several more workers, all of whom had stories similar to his own. People who had been given a second chance and were determined to make the most of it. He had become a leader in the community, not just in terms of his business, but as someone others looked up to for guidance and support. One day, as Elijah was finishing up a project on the outskirts of town, he received a call from Jack. They hadn't spoken in a few weeks, both of them busy with their respective work, but they always stayed in touch. "Elijah," Jack's voice crackled through the phone, excitement evident. "I got some big news." Elijah grinned. "Let's hear it, man." "I've been offered a full-time position at the nonprofit. They want me to stay on after the internship ends. I'll be working with them permanently, doing exactly what I've always wanted to do." Elijah's smile widened. "That's amazing, Jack. I'm so proud of you, man. You've earned it." "Thanks, Elijah. I couldn't have done it without you and my mom. You guys are my biggest inspiration." Elijah's voice softened. "You're doing your own thing now, Jack. You're building your legacy. And trust me, it's going to be something incredible." Years later, when people in the town would speak of Elijah or Jack, they wouldn't just talk about their individual accomplishments or the businesses they built. They would talk about the lives they had touched, the people they had lifted up, and the legacies they had woven together. Susan, too, would be remembered as the woman who had planted the seed of kindness, a seed that had grown into something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. Through Jack and Elijah, her legacy was alive, stretching beyond the confines of her own life and into the future. The ripple effect, as Elijah had once called it, was still spreading, and it would continue to spread, touching lives in ways no one could ever predict. But for now, as the sun set on another day, Susan, Jack, and Elijah knew one thing for certain: they had built something real, something lasting. And that was the greatest legacy of all.